What's going on, Give Me Liberty fans? We have chapter 4 for you today of the 4th edition. If you got another edition, it'll match up. Also, make sure you're checking the description for other videos, especially new curriculum videos that are out. All right, let's start off talking about slavery and empire. In the 1700s, slavery was very common in the British Empire. Many goods, such as sugar and tobacco, were traded and were based off of slave labor on plantation. The triangular trade not only benefited southern plantation owners, but it also benefited those living in port cities and cities with little slaves. There were lots of goods that were traded, again, based off of sugar, tobacco, and various crops. Liverpool and Bristol in England became banking centers, and as time progressed, slavery increased as well. So let's talk about Africa and the African slave trade. Europeans went further into African coast, and this was really started by Spain and Portugal. As Europeans developed a little more immunity to diseases, they went further and further in. And Spain and Portugal were the first European countries to really begin and exploit the slave trade. The use of guns encouraged the capture of more slaves. They would trade guns with various African tribes. The Middle Passage was this forced journey from Africa to the Americas. This was part of the triangular trade that captured slaves would take, and 1 out of 5 of them died on the first journey, and they became more entrenched. Slavery became more entrenched in the colonies. We would see harsher laws as time went on, and more racism develop as well. In the Middle Passage, no matter how bad you think it is, it was pretty much even worse. And most of the slaves were sent to Brazil or the West Indies. That's where most of the African slaves ended up. Okay, let's jump on over to Chesapeake. Do you remember what 2 counties make up the Chesapeake? Think about it. You know it. Maryland and Virginia. Good job. So in the Chesapeake, we have tobacco-based slavery. This was a huge source of income for landowners. Now, remember post-Bacon's Rebellion, and when Bacon burned down Jamestown, do you remember that? A little strip of bacon went and burned down Jamestown? Yeah, you do. What happened? More slavery increased after Bacon's Rebellion. Very important. If you're writing an essay about the growth of slavery, make sure you include this, that there's a movement from indentured servants to slaves. Now, in the Chesapeake, politicians either were planter elites or they had ties to planter elites, and they would defend and encourage the growth of slavery. So those that are making laws really had ties to slavery. A master's power in the Chesapeake over slaves increased over time, as it did everywhere else. Free blacks lost rights. They couldn't bear arms. They couldn't vote. So even blacks that were not slaves saw their rights decrease as well. And Creek Indians in South Carolina and Georgia, they would capture and sell slaves of their enemies, and they would be shipped to the West Indies to be used as slaves. Okay, like tobacco transformed the Chesapeake, rice would transform the South Carolina society. You would see the emergence of racism, and elites would be in control as well. And in the 1740s, indigo, another valuable cash crop, is introduced, and rice plantations were enormous. They were very expensive to start up. It took a lot of money to start. So these plantations would be enormous to make that money back. And Africans had some immunity to malaria, which is why they would be used on these rice plantations. It was very arduous work, lots of bugs, lots of swampland. It was just really some of the worst labor that you could do. The task system emerged, and this required slaves to complete certain tasks in a given day, and when they finished, they would then be done, and they had some time to themselves. Let's jump on over to Georgia. We have James Oglethorpe as the leader of Georgia, and Georgia was originally established to be a buffer colony between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. So if the Spanish in Florida wanted to invade South Carolina, for example, they'd have to go through Georgia. They originally banned slavery, but later on they became prosperous when they adopted South Carolina's plantation model. Now, slavery did exist in the North. Most people don't realize this. It was just on a smaller scale. New England did recognize slave marriages, and slaves did have some rights like suing in court and testifying in court, although this was very limited. Now, over time, wage labor began to replace slave labor and was more prominent because managers could fire at will, and there was less of a capital investment up front than slavery. You can hire and fire when times are good or times are bad. So like Native Americans, Africans were a very diverse group. They spoke different languages and they practiced many different religions. And they also created new music, art, and literature that was a combination of European, African, and American aspects. And here's a very famous visual of slaves on a plantation dancing and creating new music. African religions practice animism like many Native American religions, like many Native Americans, and many African slaves continued to practice their African religion and then slowly transitioned to Christianity when they came to the Americas. And they did combine aspects of both. It's very important to know they took their old traditions and combined them with aspects of Christianity. The Chesapeake slave population, they reproduced more quickly than other areas because of lower mortality rates than the Deep South. And they had more contact with whites, and they learned English more quickly than did slaves in other areas of the British colonies. South Carolina and Georgia, again, as I mentioned, they had very tough, difficult work on rice plantations, and they had less contact with whites than other areas. And northern slaves had more mobility than southern slaves, and they also had more frequent contact with whites. Slaves would often resist their status, and newspapers would be filled with ads of runaway slaves. An example of one slave rebellion you should be familiar with is the New York City Slave Rebellion. Slaves, they revolted, they set fires to houses, and they killed 9 whites. Now, this will be very important to know. Every time there is a slave rebellion, there will be harsher laws, and they will really clamp down on the slaves. So many of these slaves were executed in response, and laws become more strict and more tight. Maroon communities develop, and these are made up of runaway slaves, and they have their own distinct cultures that emerge. And in 1739, we have the Stonewall Rebellion near Charleston, South Carolina. Slaves tried to flee to Spanish Florida, and they killed many whites along the way. They were beating drums to grab attention. And a result of this, just like the New York City Slave Rebellion, many slaves were executed. And furthermore, again, I can't stress this enough, every time there's a rebellion, there will be more strict slave codes that really regulated the behavior of slaves, and not in a good way. They became much more harsh. What are some impacts of conflicts with European countries, particularly France? Well, high taxes and military establishments are created. And after the 7 Years' War, this is a very important idea. Britain begins to tax the colonies to help pay for the debt from the war. Commerce was seen as positive in the colonies. It was seen as a very good thing, and many people benefited from this, as we talked about. In Britain, there was some limited government under their constitution. The House of Commons, the Lords, and the King, here's King George III, they all kind of were able to check each other on some scale at least. And many colonists throughout the mid-18th century, in the 1750s, 1760s, they viewed the British system as the freest in the world. And we'll talk about why that changes. And liberty began to be associated with resisting arbitrary government. Arbitrary means random. So this idea that a government can just make random decisions based on how they're feeling in any given day. Please know that term, arbitrary. So Republicanism, this idea emerges and it promoted public life participation by being economically independent. Many people in the colonies wanted to be economically independent. And there was this belief that if you owned property, you were somehow more virtuous than others. So there would be a push for a lot of people to own property. Liberalism is another idea, not to be confused with liberalism today whatsoever. This focused on individuals and their private life. And the government should protect natural rights. We know that from John Locke. Think about it. What are the 3 natural rights according to John Locke? You know it. Life, liberty, property, very good. Liberalism focused on the protection of property, including slaves. So many people felt that the government should protect private property, including slaves. And many women and slaves, they begin to challenge their state based on the belief of natural rights. So the Enlightenment also encourages women and slaves to begin to question and challenge their status. So property requirements really throughout early American history were a prerequisite to voting. You couldn't vote unless you owned property. And there were more people in the colonies that could vote than in Britain because a higher percentage of American colonists owned property than did British citizens. Voting was mostly limited to men and Protestants in addition to being property owners. You saw many Catholics weren't able to vote simply because of their beliefs. 9 colonial governors were appointed by the crown or proprietors. And in South Carolina, in order to sit on the assembly, in order to be a legislature, you had to be wealthy. You had to own a certain amount of land. And New England town leaders generally were the ones who were the wealthiest. So again, we see elites and wealthy individuals that are in control. Salutary neglect, holy cow, know this. It was really this idea by this dude, Robert Walpole, who was the prime minister. And he basically said, listen, we're going to leave the colonies alone. We're going to let them develop on their own. They can even have their own governments. And if you kind of let them develop on their own, they'll be economically prosperous. So Britain really left the colonies alone as long as they were making money. This will come screeching to a halt in 1763 when the French and Indian War ends because Great Britain is in debt. Very important to know. I can't stress that enough. That is a turning point in colonial American history when Great Britain is in massive debt and they end salutary neglect. Some colonial assemblies had significant power. They could pay the governor's salary that was appointed by the crown or a proprietor. So the assemblies really had power over the governor. Dig a little deeper with assemblies. Assemblies became more vocal over time. In Pennsylvania, they had a unicameral assembly, which means a one house, and this was very powerful. And assemblies and governors sometimes did butt heads, and it would progressively get worse as time went on. Colonies printed their own money. This would later be outlawed. Here's some money printed by Pennsylvania. And later on, Britain with the Currency Act will forbid this. And this will make the colonists very upset. Britain wanted money to be paid in gold or silver. So that will be banned later. British colonies were the most democratic of all in North America when you include the Spanish and the French. Politics were often discussed in city taverns and clubs, cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia. You could walk into a tavern, and that's where people would be discussing politics. 75% of free male adults were literate in the colonies, as were 33% of women. So this is pretty good for the 18th century. And a very popular book, one of the best-selling books, is Ben Franklin's autobiography, a very influential book in American history. So freedom of speech back in the 18th century is different than what we think of it today. Freedom of speech in Britain was reserved for legislators, not citizens. So it would be okay for a legislator to criticize the government, but not necessarily for a citizen. Prior to 1695, all printed material needed a government license. And we're going to jump over to a very famous trial, the trial of John Peter Zenger. You absolutely must know this. This is a trial in 1735, and John Peter Zenger is a printer in New York. He printed negative remarks about the governor. Now, according to the law, he should have been found guilty. However, he was found not guilty, and this really helped promote the idea of freedom of the press. It's okay to begin to criticize the government, and this is really a huge turning point in freedom of the press, which we see in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So let's jump on over to the American side of the Enlightenment. There's a focus on reason, and individuals began to attack traditions not based on merit, but on hereditary privileges, things like primogeniture, the idea that the eldest son inherits all the land. That idea came under attack as a result of the American Enlightenment. Arminianism is the idea that reason could help establish religious essentials, and it's really combining religion with the idea of reason, and a new religion begins to develop called deism. And this is the idea that God created the world and then stepped back. There are a lot of famous individuals who were deists, people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Paine. They believed, yes, there is a God, but God does not intervene in the lives of daily individuals. Okay, the Great Awakening. Holy cow, star this, know this, very, very important. Ministers became concerned with waning religious piety. That's a fancy way of saying there is a decrease in religious participation. So things like the Enlightenment are driving people away from religion. So the First Great Awakening is going to bring them back. So the First Great Awakening is a religious revival in the colonies and in Europe. Dudes like this guy, John Edwards, who gave his famous speech, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, basically said, listen, God is pissed, he's angry, and you're going to go to hell if you don't convert immediately. So this really encouraged people to be baptized and to go back to the church. George Whitefield is this great orator from England, and he became very, very famous. Even Ben Franklin was very impressed by his speeches. We see the emergence, this is a very important effect of the First Great Awakening. We see the emergence of new churches, and these are called new lights. This idea that these new ministers are really kind of changing traditional sermons. So what is the impact? Well, preachers criticized commercialism. Very few of them stood against slavery and criticized slavery, and we have the emergence of new denominations. Holy cow, you must know this. New branches of Christianity begin to develop. And this is also a forerunner, it could be seen as a forerunner to the American Revolution, because people began questioning traditional authority. They began to question traditional church leaders. Spanish North America, they controlled Mexico, the Southwest U.S., the Great Plains, and then after the French and Indian War, the Louisiana Purchase. They began to colonize Texas in the early 1700s, and we'll come back to that in the mid-1830s. Presidios were military outposts that were established throughout North America by the Spanish. And in California, they established many presidios, and many natives died after the Spanish settled in their areas, again, because of diseases. And Spain sought to assimilate the natives into their society. And the French really made up present-day Canada and the Mississippi River Valley prior to the end of the French and Indian War. And they had a much smaller population than the British colonists. They only had about 65,000 people, and they were very active with their trade alliances with natives, but you know this because we've covered it in previous chapters already. Okay, so we have a battle emerging for the continent. The Ohio Valley became very important for England, France, and natives alike. Natives such as the Iroquois, they played Europeans off each other. They would kind of favor one European nation for a little bit, then switch over to another one. The Ohio Company by the British, they sought land recognition from France, and this really ignited the 7 Years' War. And it started by a dude by the name of George Washington. And the balance of power after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, was forever altered in North America. So George Washington, he helped start this war. There's a young George Washington in his 20s. And initially, the French and the natives were successful, but later the British would prevail. And France is going to be removed from North America, and Britain gained land in the Caribbean as well. So the Peace of Paris of 1763, when in doubt, a peace treaty is signed in Paris or near there. This ended the French and Indian War, and France lost Canada to Britain, and Spain lost Florida to Britain as well. So Britain really increased its holdings in North America. There is massive debt for both the British and the French. The British would begin to create new taxes such as this, the Stamp Act, and this will be resisted by the colonists. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. And the French debt would help encourage the French Revolution. So let's jump on over Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. Natives in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, they revolted against the encroachment of British colonists. So after the French and Indian War, British colonists began to expand, and Pontiac and these Native Americans revolted against it. This helped lead to the Proclamation Line of 1763. Star this bad boy, you have to know it. This prohibited westward expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The British said to the colonists, you cannot go past this line here. So all this land here in pink that the British just won from the French and Indian War, guess what, colonists? You can't touch it at all. You can't have it. So the natives could not sell land to the colonists under this proclamation line as well. And the colonists were furious. They're like, listen, bro, we just fought for the past 9 years in this war. Give us this land. The Paxton Boys was a conflict between Scots-Irish in Pennsylvania and natives in which they massacred Native American men, women, and children, and they felt that the natives were treated too well by the governor. Gee, that sounds a whole lot like Bacon's Rebellion as well. And this would demonstrate the end of positive relations that William Penn sought to establish with natives when he founded Pennsylvania. Colonists became a more unified identity after the 7 Years' War. They had this more unified identity as a whole. And the Albany Plan of Union of 1754 was Ben Franklin's vision to unify the colonies. He said we must join or die. If we don't get together and all agree, we'll be like a snake cut into a lot of pieces. We will die. However, this plan was rejected by both the colonies and Britain. And many colonists in 1763 loved being members of the British Empire. They're like, yo, we're British. We love it. That's going to come to an end, and we'll find out why in the next chapter. All right, a quick recap. Know the middle passage. Slavery in the Chesapeake versus slavery in South Carolina and Georgia. That sounds like a great short answer question to me. The creation of Georgia, why did it happen? African religions, cultures, and how they blended with America. Slave rebellions, you got to know the New York City one and Stono. Voting requirements, what were they in many colonies? Power of colonial assemblies. John Peter Zenger, holy cow, what did we learn from him? Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, The Great Awakening and its impact, everything about them. The 7 Years' War, who wins, what happens to France as a result. Definitely know that Pontiac's Rebellion led to the Proclamation Line of 1763. What was the deal with the Paxton Boys and the Albany Plan of Union? What was the goal and was it successful? All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you right back here for Chapter 5. We'll get into a famous philosopher, T-Pain. Here he is. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below. And please check out other videos in the description as well. I wish you guys nothing but the best of luck. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.